So good afternoon, all of you in the room. Good afternoon. And to all of you out there in whose room we are, good afternoon. Great. We're obviously a we. We're probably the only we who's coming up here during this conference. But really, we think this is consistent with the way that we work. So Heidi Sparks-Guber, Marilyn Darling, and Jillaine Smith, and we're the founders of Fourth Quadrant Partners, which is a company that brings emergent learning to vital mission companies throughout the world, actually. So we're thrilled to be here to be offering you a glimpse of some of the foundational principles of emergent learning. A lot of people have, at least in the Society for Organizational Learning, have begun to hear about emergent learning, but we haven't really done much to show the underpinnings of where it comes from. So this is the first time we've actually talked to a lot of you about some of the foundation of it. And we're thrilled to be doing that. And basically it's about, if you look at our logo over here, there's a byline that says it's where learning turns into results, and that's precisely what emergent learning is, and we're going to talk about how that happens. So a little over 2 years ago, after a decade of doing some great work together in the Society for Organizational Learning, Marilyn and I got together one day at the Boston Harbor and had some lobster and a martini.
We do regularly.
And what we did was what many of us in this community do, which is you get together and you share your deepest aspirations with one another. And we hadn't done that in a while, and so we were sharing what we both wanted out of life. And as it happens, both of us wanted to talk about synchronicity or serendipity. Both of us wanted to move from working with corporations to move to working with vital mission organizations that were doing cross-sector work in systems change using emergent learning. And we also happened to want to work with each other. And as these things happen, within 3 weeks we had the largest contract either of us has ever gotten, and it's a long-term contract with Living Cities, which is the largest consortium of, or an experimental consortium of the 10 largest banks in the world, and 11 foundations from the United States, including Gates and all of the big ones. So we landed into a briar patch that actually made us make good on what we said we wanted to do. Took those aspirations and have tested whether or not we could do that. And then what happened is one of our aspirations also was that we would be able to begin to share what it is that we know and do and how the results happen that do. And along came Jillaine Smith, who had run into emergent learning in working with foundations. So we now were a threesome. And we took off and started finding out about deeper parts of emergent learning through the last 2 years that we've worked at Living Cities and several of their members, which include Ford Foundation and Marilyn's at the World Bank. We have a lot of practice fields now and a community of practice. So with that genesis of what happens when people get together, share their aspirations, share vision, we thought that we would start this talk with Peter's one of his very first definitions of what a learning organization is in the first edition of Fifth Discipline. And basically what that is that a learning organization is an organization that is continually expanding its capacity to create the future. You remember that one? There's been a number of iterations, but to us, that is really the bottom line, is an organization that is continually expanding its capacity to create the future, its future. And now, organization can mean many things. For us, what that's begun to mean, and I know for Peter, we've talked to him recently about this, is that organization for us now is not just individual organizations, they're actually networks of organizations. We're at a stage in the world, just as we're at a stage for metamorphosis. We're also at a stage where networks of organizations are beginning to work together to create the futures that we want. Thank goodness, right? So basically our question, we can move on. So the question our burning question, and we do really, I love this theme of questions coming up over and over again, I'm not surprised about it, but our framing question is, not only for today but for ongoing, is what will it really take to continually expand our capacity to create the future? What does it take to do that? Great. And so our question for today is, what does it really take to do that? And what we're going to talk about is how we do that with the organizations that we work with.
And so we want to come at this from just a slightly different angle. We want to start by talking about complex adaptive systems. And I have to sneak over here for just a second. I have a favorite complexity theorist. His name is John Holland. Clap if you like John Holland's work. All right. I knew that I'd have at least a couple people here because we've been talking about this for quite a while. He wrote a book called Hidden Order. He wrote another book called Emergence. I really like this particular book. And what John Holland did is he studied lots of different kinds of systems, like many other complexity theorists. He looked at ecosystems, he looked at human systems, he looked at immune systems. And what he was particularly interested in was what's the difference between a system that's really able to adapt fairly well and a system that isn't. And so the other thing that I think was really interesting for us in terms of the work that we do in organizational learning is that he's not looking at it from the point of view of some great big grand designer or some outside observer looking at the system. He's actually looking at it from the point of view of what he refers to as agents that are on the ground doing the work. So it's kind of like this difference. So, you know, a chess game is interesting from the point of view of learning because there's a lot of learning going on, but it's only being done by two people. The chess pieces are not sentient and they don't get a vote, right? But think about all the organizations that you work in, and particularly if you're working across organizations. Those are filled with sentient beings, all of whom have a point of view and all of whom have a vote. So what we found really interesting about looking at John Holland's work is I can actually step into that picture and sort of think about what it would be to be those agents on the ground. And if we're trying to expand our capacity to create the futures that we all aspire to create, we believe that we need all of the intelligence and resourcefulness of all of those people in the room, on the ground, in real time, in order to be able to create the kind of future that we aspire to. So I want to try to explain a little bit very, very briefly about what John Holland found about these systems. And bear with me because this is the first time I've tried to do this with all of you as well. So the first thing that he's discovered is with systems where they actually do adapt is that all of the agents have some sort of a shared goal. Now you know what a shared goal should look like, at least, right, in organizations. It doesn't always look that way. But if you think about immune systems have a shared goal. They want to keep us alive and safe from invaders. So the systems that adapted had a shared goal. And then, rather than having like a strategic plan, what he observed is they bump around against each other. There's lots and lots and lots and lots of interaction, both with their environments and with themselves and their fellow agents. And through all of that bumping around, these systems learn, and they learn in a very particular way, which is they start to see patterns. Or at least the patterns start to emerge. You know, an immune system doesn't actually see a pattern, but the patterns start to emerge that allow agents in the system to be able to make generalizations and distinctions about their environment. And from those generalizations and distinctions, these agents are able to anticipate cause and effect. So I can look at these herbs, these green things, and say these would be good to eat. They would taste good. And over time, I begin to learn what would be good in pasta and what might be good in a salad. But I also begin to learn that there are some things that I shouldn't touch. So, and if any of you, I bet you there's some of you in this room who, you know, you see poison ivy, it makes you itchy. What do you think that is? That's your immune system having learned something, right? And having context markers that say, don't touch this thing. So that's kind of how he describes how systems learn. And what happens is over time, through all of these interactions, these agents sort of build what he calls building blocks of all different kinds of rules about what to do when and what not to do when. and can combine all of these rules so that when you find yourself in a completely different situation, a novel situation you've never been in before, you still know how to operate without having to have a rule for every single situation that you face, which would be literally impossible. So that's how he describes how these systems learn, which I think is fabulous. And if you think about, let's see, I have an example. Thank you, Heidi.
You're welcome.
Okay, so when you start eating, we all know this. This is a fork, right? When you start to eat, you start to learn that a fork is a good thing to use to shovel food into your mouth. But then you're presented with soup, and you realize, oh, spoon's much better for soup. But what you don't do is you don't then take the fork and throw it away and say, fork no good, spoon much better, right? You start to learn that some cases you want to have a fork, some cases you want to have a spoon, and sometimes you want to actually use them both. What am I doing? Pasta. Very good. And then over time you start to realize that, you know, if I'm eating a salad, this kind of a fork is great, but if I'm eating a lobster, I probably want a different kind of fork. So this is how we basically develop this mastery of eating, the process of eating. And over time, which I love this picture. I really resonate with the first one, frankly. Give it to me. And then, but over time, basically what we do is we build this toolkit of tools to eat. And it's the same thing for any field, anything that you master. If the master chef has a huge toolkit and has a really clear understanding about what works when, and can actually play around with things, you know, these in situations they've never been in before and make something amazing.
So that's what happens with individuals, but what happens with organizations? It's a little tougher, right? Very few organizations have toolkits that are as complex and refined as the set of forks here. Instead, it's often all forks one day, often all spoons the next day, as one management trend replaces another. For example, knowledge management might come in and compete with organizational learning for resources. Or Six Sigma is booted out by Agile. And the problem, in part, this replacement happens because organizations find that no one management approach is sufficient to really take the organization to the next level overall. But the problem with that serial trend monogamy is that organizations end up throwing out the value of, you know, the fork, if you will, of, you know, there may very well be an appropriate context where Six Sigma is the best thing, but if they've thrown it out for the next best thing that's come along, they lose the progress that they could make in achieving their goals. So going back to Holland, here's his definition for about the way that models develop. When the model is tacit, the process of discovering and combining the building blocks usually proceeds at an evolutionary time scale. In other words, really, really, really slowly. But when the model is overt, when results, for example, are captured and fed back immediately, then the time scale may be in orders of magnitude shorter.
That's what you were talking about, Art, with the rest, you know, making the thinking explicit.
Yeah. And if the system isn't good at learning, it tends to create the same solutions over and over again, making progress, if any, at a very, very slowly.
You know, when we were getting ready for this session, we were reminded about Ari de Hurst, and many of you know he's sort of considered to be the godfather of this field. And he said that for him, the single best way to measure the ability of an organization to learn is how quickly results accelerate. So do you actually see a difference? You know, does the curve go vertical in a sense? And George was talking about the Army. We had the real luxury of being able to go out and spend 10 years in the Mojave Desert, off and on, studying what kind of looked like a ragtag set of soldiers that were, many of them not much more than 20 years old, And their job was to, as soldiers were going to deploy to Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever they're going, to give them the toughest fight they'd have in the field, but have it happen before they leave the U.S. soil. Their name was the opposing force, and they were out in the Mojave Desert, and they had fewer soldiers, they had older equipment, they had bad data, and they had no other visible supports, and they often didn't have a hell of a lot of sleep either. But they would still win 99% of the time, and they would actually have to take resources away from themselves in order to do that. They had the home court advantage, so to speak, but really, really, really the thing that made the difference for them was that they had this amazingly robust learning practice that they would use every single day in real time to actually anticipate and prepare for the environments that they were in, very much like what we just described with John Holland.
And in thinking about building blocks, we want to bring up the field of meteorology, which has really done very well at this. Meteorologists over the last several decades have discovered powerful building blocks and how to combine them in ways that result in them being much better able to predict local weather. And over the years, using real-time data, they began to see patterns in ocean temperatures, in upper air pressure systems, wind and solar radiation. And they began to study how these patterns, when combined and how they interact, and that led them to discover a powerful building block, the jet stream. And that discovery led them to be able to make much more powerful and accurate and longer range weather predictions. And we surmise that that pace of discovery will continue to accelerate.
So this concept of building blocks is really important in learning work. What it means is that building blocks like finding out how the jet stream works so that you can accelerate the way that you communicate what's going to happen with the weather, and that gets more and more reliable. Building blocks like that help to resolve one element of the complexity or the complications of what it is that you're looking at and learning. And once you can establish that building block, make it explicit, make it something that you can stand on, what that allows you to do is to go into finer and finer details of the complexity that's next. If that is left tacit, there's no way to stand on it and actually go and move forward. So when that part is resolved, we are actually freed to do that finer work as demonstrated by all those forks. You can get into finer and finer. And that's what we're finding with our clients. They're getting into finer and finer hypotheses, and I'll get to that in a second. So the emergent learning tools that we're going to touch on in a few minutes that we're going to show you that come from this theory put into practice. These tools, and also we're going to be doing the two of them that I highlight. We're going to be doing them tomorrow and the next day as well, using your knowledge and your collective wisdom. These are primary building blocks that we have found that have helped us help our organizations turn iterative practices of learning into accelerated results. And that is how we actually measure our own results. Is that iterative learning practice actually turning into accelerated results that you can see and measure. But the building blocks are essential to that. So these rules about anticipated cause and effect that accumulate with experience and are made explicit are also, this is a second insight from John Holland that we really build our work on, is that those things are called hypotheses. They're not called the truth. They're called hypotheses. So if we go to the next slide. So a hypothesis, starts out as when a certain situation happens, if you do a certain action, then a certain result will happen. If an action, then a result. And then what we're finding, though, is that they're actually situational. So when you do the if-then, really what you're looking for is in what situation, as with the forks, in what situation with this action does this happen? And the more that a team can actually begin to make those distinctions, the finer and finer their ability to accelerate those results predictably. So this is what we do when we learn. I mean, in fact, Ari DeHuss, in looking at the emergent learning work we were doing, pointed out that one of the things that we do really well as individuals is we're making hypotheses all the time. When you're going from here to that door over there, your mind is constantly presenting you with what he calls multiple futures, les avenirs, the multiple futures of what could possibly happen to you. and you very quickly adapt as that thing happens or not. When we get together as a collective, that doesn't work so well. We're not so good at doing that. We start to get identified with the hypothesis we're stuck with, and it starts to become a conflict rather than the and that we talked about with polarity. Now, so for example, an example of a hypothesis that you make is that when you packed to come here, you probably looked at the weather for Washington, D.C., I know I did, and you kind of made some hypotheses about how that weather would be. You were either right or you weren't. But you packed several different situational possibilities and added a few layers, and you were off and running. Now, we go crazy when we see organizations who read lessons learned, and organizations have volumes of lessons learned, right? And then they make blanket statements about what teams should do or shouldn't do in particular complex situations. So that would be the equivalent of you having a best practice coat that you always brought along, regardless of what the weather was going to be. So we are we're willing to accept best practices as one end of the spectrum, but actually we're much more interested in what happens when you're actually testing hypotheses rapidly in what's really going on and allowing the system to learn. So right now, if you think about it, you think about the plethora of situations that you're in whenever you look at what could affect how you approach your important initiatives. So let's name some. For some, it's the size of the budget. Often one of the things is the political clout or capital of the leader that's behind you. If you have the CEO of the company, everybody's trying to get the CEO of the company. Why? Because that allows you less complexity about whether the thing will be supported. Or if you don't, if you have someone with less clout, you choose a whole different set of ways to achieve what you're about. And these are the situational hypotheses in action, right? Complex adaptive systems use these simple structures to learn because it allows for flexible, conditional responses to situations. If one action does not achieve the expected result, you have a resilient ability to move to the next one very quickly. It's multiple futures. It just means it's time to try another action. It doesn't mean what you were going to do was wrong. It just means it's time to switch. And you never, ever stop learning. This is what's important, is the system continually expands its ability to take in greater and greater combinations of hypotheses. Holland, in short, says something very startling for some of us who believe in alignment and working through all that. He says, in short, that the consistency is overrated. In his own computer models, he observed that those systems that have lots of contradictions built into them go much faster. They actually literally go faster in solving the problems that they're assigned to give. And systems working in lockstep just simply can't do that. So here we are, we're made to do that kind of thing. And the only thing that keeps us from doing that is our own mental models. So the counterintuitive view of this is that instead of insisting on alignment and consistency to be adaptive, systems need to, 1, welcome multiple, often competing hypotheses, and 2, have a system in place for testing those so that the learning continually be applied and built through time. So this is the way that we say it is to play when we're willing to play with multiple futures and to create the ones that we care about, is to be able to do that kind of rapid iterative testing, otherwise known as life. We'll show you just now. I'm going to I just wanted to repeat before we do that, just to remind you what we were saying earlier about what Holland described. If you're trying to compress the time it takes to achieve the outcomes that you want to achieve, you need to have a goal and know what success would look like. You need to interact a lot. Look for patterns in what happens, create hypotheses, and as Heidi said, the more the better, and if they're competing hypotheses, actually even better. Test them out as quickly as you can and notice what seems to work. Great.
Which brings us to the focus of our work over the past 15 plus years, collectively, which has been making this process that we've been describing explicit rather than tacit. A lot of what we've been sharing up here is common sense, but organizations don't think this way, or they don't consciously think this way, and they don't make it explicit, and that's part of what our work is, and we call it emergent learning, because the learning that's going on about what works and what doesn't emerges from the real work of organizations, from the real people doing the work on the ground. One of the challenges with organizational learning is that when we invest in robust systems thinking, we tend to get invested in one solution or best practice, in large part because of how much time and money we've invested in trying to solve these challenges. But unfortunately, our overemphasis on best practices results in the loss of the very flexibility and adaptability and adaptation that is critical for addressing complex problems. We believe that to create the capacity to shape its future, an organization needs to create not a solution, but a framework or context in which individual agents, as Marilyn was describing earlier, can freely experiment with the hypotheses, then use the results to build rich, robust models about what works and what doesn't. And this is why I fell in love with emergent learning. Well, not exactly this, but there is some humor and humility involved in the task. Emergent learning, one of the things that really drew me, I come from organizational development, strategic planning, nonprofit organizational capacity building. And in that field, as perhaps in your fields, there are always prescribed solutions. We're always trying the next, like I was talking about earlier, the next big thing. And when I first witnessed Marilyn doing emergent learning, I was curious to see, well, how's this approach, how's this model going to be different? And I was blown away by its simplicity, its absolute beauty, and its that it did, in particular, that it did not dominate the room. It was not some process that had to be overly facilitated and carefully structured, and you had certain things you had to do. It was really simple, based on some simple questions, and drawing upon the expertise in the room around a burning question that the people in the room cared about, whether it's inside of one organization or across multiple organizations. And also very much that it was grounded in our real work. The end of the time together, she literally had us pull out our calendars and say, what is coming up on your calendar where you can test out this new thinking that you've learned. And I'd never seen that part of the loop closed before.
Good. So two of our fundamental tools, which, as I said, we will be demonstrating tomorrow and the next day. The first one is the emergent learning tables. How many of you have worked on an emergent learning map or table? Yeah, a few people have done that. We did this with the liaison officers for Seoul for several years. So the emergent learning table starts with the framing question. Probably one of the most important things working with the team is actually to have them create the framing question as the boundary of the field of play. What does that say? 2 minutes.
Yep.
We start in the emergent learning table starting with stories and data, real experience. We move up to collective, this is where the collective knowledge kicks in, collective insights about the patterns that are being seen. This third quadrant is the hypotheses. That's when out of what's happened in the past, we start to create the multiple hypotheses we're going to test. And then the fourth quadrant, which is what we're named after, we're fourth quadrant partners, is the part where those hypotheses get embedded into the work going forward. So that becomes a testing field so that there's a rapid iteration of learning from that collective knowledge. The second tool is the before and after action review, which we mentioned, which actually were created by the young soldier, or the Army and the soldiers, the leadership development of the Army over 30 years of work. And basically it's a similar process, only it's once you have your plan, it's what do you do day by day that keeps this iterative practice in play and keeps this knowledge explicit. And so what that is that in the before action review, which in the Army is called leader's intent, but when we work with organizations it's called before action review, it's when we actually identify the aspirations, make them explicit, so that we know what it'll look like when they're accomplished. We imagine and play with the challenges. The challenges is what will we expect, we're actually doing mini rehearsals about what's going to happen no matter what shows up on the field. Amazingly important for people to test that out.
You could, by the way, just let me interrupt to say that's all about recognizing patterns and anticipating cause and effect, which is what Holland was talking about.
We embed what did we learn from last time? What have you already learned from previous lessons that can now be applied to that? It's amazing how much knowledge is tacit that people don't even think they have. And then finally, what will make us successful next time? We then bookend that at the end of each of the events that we're working with in a strategy or in a particular initiative with the after action review, which actually looks again at what were our intended results, not what happened, but what did we say was going to happen, what actually happened, what caused those results, and those get deeper and deeper with practice. In the beginning, you only get surface cause. It's amazing how quickly the team goes deep into that. And what is our next opportunity to test our thinking so that we're always embedding it in the next action? What lessons should we take forward for real time? We've done this, one team I was working with at Living Cities, we did maybe 20 events of these over a set of 6 months. And within those months had achieved the results that we thought were going to take another year and a half. So, but because they not only were producing the results, they were also increasing their capacity to aim for and get the results they wanted. So, what does it take to continually expand our capacity to create the future? We've talked a little bit about what we think it takes. One way is to step into the work and the rapid iterative process of reflection. Now, many of us in this field know how much resistance there is to people stopping and doing that. I was working with a venture capitalist at Living Cities, head of capital innovation, and her first comment was, why the hell would I stop and do 30 minutes with you on this when I could be making deals? Well, after about 2 months, when she started to find how her ability to make deals started to increase, the trajectory, she is now one of our greatest champions. She's the one who always makes people stop, do a BAR before they do anything, pick up the learning, apply it, and track the fact that they're accelerating their results. Because one of the things that happens to us as people is as we achieve what we said we wanted to, there's an amnesia that we ever said that we couldn't do that. So being able to actually acknowledge that you did what you said you didn't think you could do before is actually one of the parts of the whole thing. So finally, in Marilyn's case, when she was talking to one of the young soldiers, she asked him, and I'll close with this, she asked him, what would you do? She was on the field watching the battle in Mojave Desert. He was up there on the hill.
He was dead because he'd
dead.
gotten shot, so we had nothing to do until they reconstituted him.
She said, what would you do if they removed the practice of the AAR? And he said, he looked at her and he said, that would be the stupidest thing the Army could ever do. And he said that because his life depended on it. So that's why we've taken those, what were very simple practices that we've learned that have produced phenomenal results that even we're surprised at, and we love offering them to you.
Thanks for letting us practice with you.